Bonjour and welcome back to our history of the United States since 1877, and more specifically to our cycle of lectures on the Roaring Twenties. In the past two lectures, we talked about the political life of the 1920s, which was dominated by the three Republican presidents of the era, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, and then we moved on to more the social culture of the period, the flappers and so forth. Today, we will continue by looking at the economics of the decade, and buckle up, it's going to be a bit of a roller coaster ride. We will start with the roaring economy of the 1920s, and then we will hit the crash of 1929, and that will then usher in the Great Depression of the 1930s, which will only end with World War II. So let's start with the good old times, the 1920s prosperity era. The policies in Washington were inspired by the conservative beliefs of the Gilded Age, what Warren Harding, the president from 1921 to 1923, would have dubbed a return to normalcy or normality. And normal to him meant a small government, supply and demand, the law of the market, and a pro-business environment. Most of the spending by the government during the decade is rather low. Most of the cabinet members during that decade would have to deal with small budgets. One of the exceptions would be a man called Herbert Hoover, whom we'll encounter again in just a second, who in the 1920s was Secretary of Commerce. And he's one of the few with growing budgets during the 1920s because his job is to promote American business abroad as Secretary of Commerce. Another prominent member of the cabinet of Warren Harding was Andrew Mellon. Not too well known around here in Louisiana, but quite prominent in Pennsylvania. He came from a big family of bankers. A very rich man, but also Secretary of the Treasury throughout the 1920s under the three presidents that we mentioned. In fact, he was so prominent that people like to joke that he was the only Secretary of the Treasury under whom three presidents served. He was a big proponent of trickle-down economics, which means to cut taxes on the rich. Remember that from the progressive era, we have the appearance of the income tax, which is graduated. The rate is nil for the low brackets, and then it grows and grows, and it's the highest for people in the upper income bracket. The policy of Mellon was to cut those tax rates, and they go down quite a bit in the 1920s. So what is the rationale behind it? Well, it is that the people in the upper brackets also happens to be job creators, captains of industry, entrepreneurs of some kind. And if you allow them to keep more of their income by reducing the taxes on the upper brackets, they are more likely to invest and want to make more money. And everybody will benefit from that because they own businesses and the like. The expression is that a rising tide will lift all boats, or that the wealth will trickle down from the top all the way to the bottom. This eventually became a big feature of conservative politics. We'll talk about it again when we talk about the big tax cuts that Ronald Reagan had in the 1980s. And then George W. Bush around the 2000s, and then Donald Trump in the 2010s. Another potential rationale for trickle-down economics, though obviously Mellon would not state so publicly, is that it benefits the rich. And he is a banker, he is rich, his family is rich, his friends are rich. So this might have been a bit of a self-serving policy. So what are the results of that policy by the Republicans in the 1920s? By and large, the economy is doing well. I can show you a whole bunch of graphs, and typically they are doing quite well. The GDP grows, which is how big the economy is and how much it grows from year to year. That's up throughout the 1920s, at least up until the crash of 1929. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is how much stock prices are, that's another way to measure the strength of the economy. That's also going very high up in the 1920s, again until the crash. And also the unemployment rate has a tendency to be low, again, until the Great Depression. That's typical of tax cuts. It has a tendency to boost the economy, but tax cuts aimed at the rich will also result in great income disparity, meaning that the bulk of the benefits of those tax cuts will tend to go to the top 1% or even 0.1%. And that's another aspect of the 1920s. There is great income inequality. The rich do quite well, and the poor not so well. So it's not even growth, and the growth of wages, which is what most people get, would not be quite as significant as that of stocks, which is where rich people get the bulk of their money. Another reason why the 1920s are prosperous would have nothing to do with the policies of whoever is in charge in Washington, D.C. but more the business expertise of the people that actually run the company. This is a decade when the concept of the division of labor really comes into its own. The theory of it goes way back. If you read Adam Smith and his book The Wealth of Nations back in 1776, he advocates the division of labor when it comes to pin manufacturing. But division of labor really came into its own in the 1920s when it was pushed by Taylor and then put into practice by Ford of the Ford Motor Company. Here's how it works. Instead of making a car as if it were a work of art, you have a handful of very skilled workers who pretty much make the car from scratch and are able to do everything when it comes to building the car. You instead divide whatever amount of work you have to do a car into a series of small bits, maybe 500 or 1,000 small steps. And as a worker, you're only responsible for one of those small steps, which might be to put the rear left tire on the car and to tighten those 4 bolts. Why is it so superior to having a skilled worker doing it? Well, for one thing, a skilled worker costs far, far more than an unskilled worker. It doesn't take long to train somebody to tighten 4 bolts. To teach somebody how to build a whole car from scratch is more difficult. Beyond that, even though you are a poorly paid, unskilled worker, if the only thing you do all day long is to tighten 4 bolts, you're going to get very, very good at it. And so you will really not waste any time. And so the productivity goes way up, even though you're using unskilled laborers. So it's kind of a win-win situation, at least for the employer. Ford added to this concept of the division of labor that of the conveyor belt, where you put the cars on a conveyor belt and you move those cars from worker to worker so that the workers don't even lose time going from spot to spot and carrying their tools with them, and you shave a few more seconds. The impact for the working class was quite tremendous, however. For that, I would recommend watching 2 movies. The first one is a German silent classic from the 1920s. It's called Metropolis, which is a kind of a dystopian environment where you have an underclass of workers dominated by their masters, and all these workers have been turned into automatons, into robots. Kind of a stark portrayal of the way in which the inequalities between the rich and the poor in the 1920s are creating a 2-class system. My second movie recommendation is equally good. It's a bit more fun. It's The Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin, this time an American movie. And there's a famous scene in there where Charlie Chaplin works in a factory assembling, well, we're not exactly sure where he assembles. He's only in charge of tightening 1 bolt, but the work has become so dehumanizing that we never quite figure out what he's working on. It's just 1 cog in a machine. Quite literally, because at some point there is a scene played for comedic effect where Charlie Chaplin gets stuck in the machine and gets carried from cog to cog as a real embodiment of the fact that he has now become part of the machine as a worker. Another comedic scene shows him facing management that is trying to shave minutes of his work by having him take his lunch break while he's working. And so they invent a complicated machine to feed him corn on the cob and soup and all of that while he's still working at the conveyor belt, and everything is automatic. Again, played for comedic effect, but very, very representative of the time. So there's good and there's bad coming out of the division of labor. Higher productivity, but it also turned the working class into disposable cogs in the machine. Unfortunately, the economic boom of the 1920s did not last forever. Eventually, the economy hit a wall, and that would be the famous crash of October 29. This is one of the most studied events in 20th century economic history, and economic historians have come up with a whole list of reasons why the economy crashed when it did. Though I must say that this is all done with 2020 hindsight. If you ask an economist to predict exactly where the stock market is going to be 1 or 2 years from now, they would not know for sure, otherwise we would all be rich. So with this being said, what led to the crash of 29? Well, one thing I had mentioned earlier is that there's a big gap between the rich and the poor in the 1920s, as a lot of the rich, the 1%, get a big chunk of the benefits of the stock market boom, while others don't see their wages go quite as high. And most importantly, productivity and GDP growth go higher than wage growth, meaning that the economy is very, very good at producing more and more things every year, especially electrical products, for example, or agricultural products. Meanwhile, the workers don't see their wages rise quite as fast, and so you end up with a gap between how much is produced and how much can be purchased. This was a problem that had been identified by Ford of the Ford Motor Company, who, even though he could have paid his unskilled workers very poorly, had decided to give them a wage of $5 a day, which back then was serious money. And his rationale for it was that the workers for Ford were not just employees, they were also potentially customers. And if you did not pay your workers well, then who is going to buy all these millions of Ford Model Ts that you're cranking out all throughout the decade? And he had a good point. Unfortunately, many of the other employers did not see the same conclusion, and so would pay workers as little as they could get away with, and as a result, there's a lack of purchasing power in the economy. Meanwhile, there is a production of a lot of goods, specifically farming products. So the two don't quite match, and having too many products chasing too few customers would become a huge problem during the Great Depression. Another issue that is connected to the end of World War I would be European debts. The United States had loaned a lot of money to its allies during World War I, specifically France and Britain, and insisted on getting that money paid back. Meanwhile, to punish Germany for having lost World War I, they were supposed to pay very heavy reparations to France and other victors, which they struggled to pay, and to pay back those reparations, in part, they borrowed money, including from American banks. So there's a lot of outstanding loans internationally. And because the United States was still a very protected country, tariff-wise, it's difficult for other countries, like, say, Germany, to sell products into the US. So you have a difficult situation where Germany is supposed to reimburse debts to the United States, or France, or Britain, but somehow cannot earn the needed cash by selling goods into the US market. Beyond that, there are excesses of speculation in the 1920s, whether it's in stocks or real estate. Let's start with real estate, specifically Florida, which is a state that, well, was a state of the US before, but was really quite minor, mostly a vast swamp as far as most Americans were concerned, up until the 1920s, where the state really took off. Railroad lines are in place by then, as well as roads. Some people have more disposable income, so you have the beginning of a tourism boom in the United States. And Florida, with its mild climate and its beautiful beaches, would receive many of these tourists. So people flock to Miami Beach and so forth, and what used to be mangrove and swamp that was worth just pennies per acre suddenly becomes valuable because you have a lot of movie stars moving in and building mansions. And if you're a real estate speculator, you're saying, well, that's great, let's buy land and resell it 2 years from now for 10 times what I bought. And that's a good idea, except that this goes out of hand. People get so excited that they flock to Florida and buy real estate, even if it's very far from Miami Beach, deep inside Florida, and the value is not that great and you'll never sell a house there. Well, you just hold it for 6 months because the price of everything keeps going up, and you just unload your real estate to the next sucker who will think that he will be fine as long as he can resell it 6 months later to another sucker. And you have the makings of a mania, of a boom, of a speculative bubble, as it is called. So the boom continued until 1925, where, surprise, surprise, you have a hurricane in Florida, and that kind of put a damper on the tourism boom, and incidentally, the real estate boom as well. And the minute that people stop buying, then the whole speculative bubble just collapses, and that was a major crisis in Florida, and that's a few years before the actual 29 crash. In Wall Street, you have the same situation where people drive up the price of assets way beyond their underlying value. It is normal that the stock prices go up if the economy is doing well. A stock is just a share in a company. You're buying a piece of that company. And if generally people are getting richer and sales are up and profits are up, it's normal that the value of the company and then your shares would go up. But it can only go up based on how much the economy as a whole is doing. If profits go up by 20%, stocks should go up by 20%. If they go up by 50 or 100% because people are getting very, very excited about investing in the stock market, then you have what is called a speculative bubble. And that's definitely true, especially by the late 1920s, where the stock market has been going up so long that people think that will always go up, that there's no downside risk, and they want to jump into the stock market and buy stocks at whatever price, just for the sake of raking in easy cash, because, well, the stock market will never crash. And that led to some risky financial practices such as margin buying. And if you're not familiar with that, here's how it works. It means buying stocks with borrowed money. Let's say you want to buy $1,000 of stocks and you invest your own $1,000, and then the stock, doubles in price. And then, well, that means you make a profit of $1,000, $2,000 selling price minus the $1,000 investment. If, on the other hand, with your $1,000, you had borrowed an extra $9,000 from the bank so that you can buy $10,000 worth of stocks and you still double the value of those stocks, then you can sell $20,000 worth of stocks. And by the time you have reimbursed the $9,000 that you borrowed from the bank, the $1,000 that you eventually invested out of your own pocket, then you have now made a $10,000 profit. So why doesn't everybody do that? Well, there's a simple reason that stocks go up but also down. And let's revisit the scenario if the stocks go down by 80%, which is what happened after the 29 crash. That $1,000 worth of stock that you bought with your own money is now worth only $200, and so you now have only $200 left in the bank. You're not broke, but you lost a bunch of money in the market. If, however, you had borrowed an extra $9,000 from the bank, and to have $10,000 worth of stocks altogether, which are now worth only $2,000 after an 80% drop, well, you only have $2,000 now in the bank, except you're still responsible for those $9,000 loans to the bank plus interest. So now you are in the red, you are bankrupt. You haven't just lost part of your savings. You owe more than you were worth in the first place. And that's why it's a very, very dangerous kind of strategy to employ. Well, people did that, and that's why in October of 1929, what became known as Black Tuesday, when the stock started to collapse, that created a lot of problem for people who had invested in the stock market in a way that was not always safe. And Black Tuesday is not just a single day. You have Black Wednesday and Black Thursday, and the whole October is a bad year, and the stocks go down and recover a tiny bit and go down further. In fact, it's not until 1932 or thereabouts that the stock market finally hit bottom after having lost something like 80% of its value. As of 1929, only a few people actually own money in the stock market. So how do you go from a handful of bankers losing their shirt in the market to a larger recession hitting the entire country or even eventually the world for the better part of a decade? How did the crisis spread? To answer that question, it might be worth revisiting some definitions because people are not always clear on those economic terms. A stock market crash simply means that the value of the stocks in Wall Street go down. So it's purely a paper loss that would only affect a handful of investors. A recession means that the production of a country, the GDP, what measures everything that is produced in a country, not just the stocks, but actual real things like cars and such, well, the GDP goes down, that a country will produce less than it used to, by maybe 2, 3, or 4%. A depression means a recession that lasts many, many years, not just a quarter or two, and that is so severe that even unemployment hits very high levels, and the prices will start to have negative inflation because nobody wants to buy anything anymore. So you have deflation. So it's something far more severe than a recession, which is itself far more severe than just a simple blip in the stock market. So you start with that blip in the stock market and the crash. This led to a crisis in the banking sector as well because many banks own a stocked portfolio. So when Wall Street goes down, same thing with the banks. And some banks might have loaned money to investors who had then bought on margin and they go bankrupt, and so that results in a loss for the bank. So as a result, many banks actually went bankrupt and closed down. Nowadays, the government has a tendency to bail out the banks to prevent some kind of panic on the stock market. Back then, it's more a government that embraces capitalism. So if a bank makes bad investments, they actually shut down. And quite a few did. By the time you hit the bottom of the Great Depression in 32, 33, close to half the banks in the country had either shut down operation or gone under altogether. Nowadays, if your bank does poor business and loses money, you're kind of safe as an investor because whatever money you have put there in your savings account or your checking account or some kind of a CD would be protected. On all the bank statements that you get, you'll see FDIC insured, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That's a creation of the 1930s, and it simply means that the government will protect you up to, I think it's $100,000 or $200,000. It's a big limit, far more than you most likely have in your bank account. And so even if your bank goes under, the government will bail you out. Well, that's a creation of the 1930s. It did not exist at the beginning of the Great Depression. So if your bank actually went under, you as just a private customer, even if you never invested in the stock market, you might lose all your lifelong savings that were in something supposed to be more safe, like a CD or a checking account. So people were aware of that, and whenever they had hints that their bank might not be doing too well, they would simply have a run on the bank, which is exactly what it sounds like. You run to the bank and try to get all your money out before the bank goes down under. And you probably are familiar with the scene in the movie It's a Wonderful Life where there is such a run on the bank. And it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy because banks typically don't have on hand all the cash needed to reimburse every customer that they have. All that money is out invested in loans and such. And so if every customer shows up and says, I want all that cash now, the bank, whether it's doing well or not, will go under. So there's a big bank crisis, which eventually turns into a crisis for many Americans who have lost their money, their lifelong savings. And that's true of about half the customers, about half the banks go under or shut down at some point. So that leads eventually to a consumer crisis, because if you've just lost all your lifelong savings, that's not exactly the time when you'll go out and buy a car. So people curtail their spending dramatically. And that means that the orders for goods from companies go down. And remember that originally there is already underconsumption in the US. So the glut of products on the markets gets worse. And so companies start to fire people in order to produce less than they used to. And so that leads to an unemployment crisis. So those people who have recently been made redundant will then cut down their spending, which leads to another round of cuts among the companies because their customers are fewer. And you can see how it's a vicious cycle that will just go on and on and on for years. And the unemployment rate hit 10 and even 20 and at the highest 25%. And there's no real protection because most states at that point do not have unemployment benefits. Medicare, Medicaid don't exist, food stamps don't exist. So there's very little safety net. If you lose your lifelong savings in the bank, if you lose your job, you're really out on your own. And that led to really great desperation. Ultimately, two things happen. The first thing is that the banks recall the loans. All that money had been loaned out to people in France, Britain, and Germany, and they can't quite pay all that money right there and then, especially since the US has very high tariff rules to protect itself from foreign competition. And so that exported the crisis to Europe. Also, the United States stopped buying products from abroad, in part because of that very high tariff rule that I mentioned, the so-called Smoot-Hawley tariff. And beyond that, American customers are broke, so the last thing they're going to do is buy from abroad. So the US economy, which by that point is the largest in the world, suddenly just collapses. And let's imagine that you're Brazil and your main export would be coffee beans, which are often exported to the American market. Well, most customers in the US don't buy coffee anymore because that's kind of a luxury that they can do without. They focus on bread or milk or essentials. And so the entire economy of Brazil just went down the drain like that. And just about every country in the world was it like that, with the exception of maybe Russia, which was a communist economy and so very, very closed off from the world and kind of insulated from the effects of the Great Depression. So the impact for real people was quite great. I don't want it to be just about statistics. When you see that the unemployment rates hit something like 25% by the early 30s, that's a major impact for many lives. Again, people do not have unemployment benefits. Many households are relying on a single income. So if one person loses a job, then the whole family is in dire financial straits. And women typically don't have a job in the 1930s because in many states, if you are a married woman, the law tells you cannot have a job. There are so few jobs around that the expectation is that the few jobs that exist will be reserved for men only. So it's not like today where if the husband loses a job, then you might get by on the income of the wife. That is often not an option in the 1930s. That terrible situation was compounded in the American Midwest and Great Plains by a freak weather phenomenon known as the Dust Bowls. Not quite that freak. It's based on a drought, which happens quite a bit in northern Texas or Oklahoma or Kansas. But the drought was quite severe, and so severe, in fact, and whenever there would be a lot of storm and wind activity, it would pick up all the kicked mud, all the dry dirt, and then you'd have those dust bowls, those big clouds of dust. So the farmer is not stressed that you've lost this year's crop because there was a major drought, but you've even lost the topsoil, and so you have lost next year's crop as well. And you have tremendous hardships in the heart of America, around northern Texas, Oklahoma, and such. Those people were often nicknamed the Okies, which was kind of an insult. It was like hillbillies or white trash. And usually they had to leave. And there's a great novel about one such family It's called The Grapes of Grass, which I highly recommend. And like many Okies from Oklahoma, the family at the heart of the novel ends up in California, where they have more hardships and I think end up being migrant workers picking up oranges. Other workers, when they have lost their house to foreclosure, will end up being pretty much hobos, and they set up makeshift kind of shacks with whatever material they can recuperate, and they created slums, what became known derisively as Hoovervilles after the American president. The United States, that was really in the up and up in the 1920s, started to look more like a third world country. Well, let's move on to Hoover, since there's a ville named after him. Herbert Hoover is the third American president from that decade. His biography is kind of interesting. He came from pretty much nothing. He was orphan, came from a Quaker family, as I recall. But it was really a up by his bootstraps kind of story, a Horatio Algier story. But he got into a career into mining, and he was an important consultant throughout the Pacific and China and Australia in his life, and made a lot of money like that, to the point where I think he was a millionaire by his 30s, which back then was a serious achievement. But he would be also a philanthropist who was not just about making money, but also redistributing it. And during World War I, he actually led a big relief effort to help some of the civilians that had been displaced by war in Europe. So Hoover was a Republican, widely respected for his role as Secretary of Commerce in the 20s, shoo-in for the nomination as president in 1928, elected, very popular, took office in March of 29, that's when the inauguration was back then for presidents, and he was unlucky enough that just 6 months later, through no fault of his own, the stock market crashed. He's not a bad man per se, he was just kind of constrained by the ideology that he had, even though he tried to have some relief for the poor. At the same time, he's trying not to spend too much because he's afraid of an unbalanced budget, and so that limited the kind of priming the pump that was necessary at that time. The most famous incident took place during the so-called Bonus Army episode. The Bonus Army would be composed of World War I veterans who had been promised some kind of pension, aka a bonus, in their retirement, except by the 1930s, many of them had lost their job or in dire financial straits and asked the government to pay the pension ahead of time. So that's what they are, the Bonus Army. They're not an actual army, they're just veterans. For lack of better options, they just went to Washington, D.C. and set up a Hooverville right there in the heart of the city to petition Congress. And the answer by Congress and Hoover was, no, we're out of cash. We don't want to run red ink, even in the middle of a recession or a depression. You'll just have to wait 10 or 20 years until your pension is due. So that was seen as rather cold, uncaring, considering that these are people that had risked their life for the country back in World War I, and now in their moment of need, their country would not pay them back. And to make matters worse, the Hoover ordered that the army clear the slum from Washington, D.C., and that was done in a rather heartless fashion, just going to people's slums, people living in dire poverty, and at dawn just destroying their house and pushing them out at bayonet point. And some people that later became quite famous in World War II, I think General MacArthur, for example, were involved in that Bonus Army operation of chasing the Bonus Army out of Washington. So that's the situation as of 1932, where many Americans are really starting to lose faith in themselves. Because people are still dealing in the undeserving poor theory. So if you have lost your job, in a way, people think, I must be a failure of some sort. Why can't I find a job? Why can I not feed my family? The country itself was in dire straits. We had had recessions before, even depressions, but one that would last for 3-4 years and more with no end in sight, that was unprecedented. So people start thinking that maybe capitalism is not working. At the very same time that communism in Russia seemed on the outside to be doing quite well, so maybe that system might be doing better. In the 1930s, Germany, which was hit hard by the Great Depression, recovered pretty well under the policies of Adolf Hitler. So people start thinking maybe democracy is not working too well, maybe we should shift to fascism instead. So you see that the centrists in the US that are in favor of a free market democracy are threatened on the far left by the communist rival and on the far right by the fascist model. And you're starting to question whether the entire principles on which the American Constitution was based would be revisited. And there's great fear that maybe a fascist in the mold of Mussolini from Italy or Hitler from Germany might take over in the United States. We had talked before of that novelist, Sinclair Lewis, who had written Babbitt and Main Street back in the 1920s, kind of a comical looks at middle-brow American society. In the 1930s, he came with a more somber novel called It Can't Happen Here. And it was kind of a science fiction novel about what would happen if a demagogue in the fascist mold tried to run for president in the US. And in the novel, many people are saying, well, we're protected, we're a long-standing democracy, there's no way our people would fall for it, it can't happen here. And that's where the title of the novel comes from. So the title is ironical because it does happen in a novel and you have a fascist dictator of the United States. So that's the kind of fear that people have in 1932 as the economy hit bottom. It was a presidential election year, people wondering, will we have a democracy next year? Who is going to run for president on the Democratic side? Because obviously a Democrat will be elected next time. Hoover is so unpopular. Will the entire American experiment in free market democracy collapse? Well, I will hold you in suspense. We will get the answer next time as we talk about the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal. Au revoir and goodbye.